The United Nations World Food Programme says that trucks carrying food aid have now entered Ethiopia's war-torn Tigray region for the first time since December. The delivery of aid comes amid rising fears of starvation and deaths in Tigray. The UN has previously estimated that around 350,000 people were facing famine-like conditions.
According to the world's largest humanitarian organization, trucks carrying aid arrived safely in Mekelle, Ethiopian territory controlled by Tigrayan forces, for the first time in 3 months. The delivery of aid comes after a humanitarian truce was agreed between government and Tigrayan forces. Meanwhile, roads from neighboring region of Afar remain closed despite a ceasefire as warring parties continue to block aid. The Ethiopian government says it remains committed to ensure the safe passage of aid arrives to the more than 5.5 million people in need of assistance. The 16-month-old conflict in the Horn of Africa nation has left thousands dead, displaced more than 2 million people, fueled famine, and gave rise to a wave of atrocities.
Well, to help us unpack this a little bit more, we're now joined by Horn of Africa analyst Abdullahi Boru Halakhe. He joins us now via Zoom. It's been a while. Thanks so much indeed for joining us. Good to have you on the program.
My pleasure, my brother.
All right, so relief for the people inside Tigray. This really will make a difference.
It is, Peter. I know there are people out there who might say, look, these sort of things have happened between the TPLF and the federal government, but the numbers speak for itself. You know, this is the Tigray region, the 5.5 million people are facing serious, starvation-like situation. And these are the first 13 or 20 convoys, depending on who you are listening to, of the 100 that is needed to really save lives. The last few weeks and months have been dire. This is a good news, albeit we all have to be fairly cautiously optimistic. But then again, it's not just the Tigray region, it's the Amhara region, it's the Afar region. And in terms of the drought, if this coming April rain fail, you're looking at a larger problem of probably slightly under 14 million people in the entire region of the Horn of Africa facing severe famine and drought. So for what has been a really dire situation over the last 16 months, this is a good and positive, and may it continue.
Who had been blocking this aid coming through? Because the humanitarian organizations have been desperate to try and help those inside Tigray. Why couldn't they get through?
I think, like with many problems on the continent, like with many conflict situations, the government was the primary entity that was blocking humanitarian aid going to this region. The government has made it very clear that they are not fighting the Tigray people, they are fighting the TPLF and the elite that controls the Tigray government. But I think it will be very difficult to not see this as an effort to punish the Tigrayan people for electing the leaders that they've had. And so I think the biggest problem was the government. That is not to say the government was the only one who was blocking aid. In certain areas, because of the conflict that TPLF is engaging, including in the Afar region, where they still control some towns, I think they have been denying people access. However, I think for most of the humanitarian groups, despite what they might say, that level of conflict doesn't really lend itself to organization in sending people in such a conflict, particularly when they could be the target, when aid is not moving. So what would be your role there, aside from just becoming a moving target, at the crosshairs of all these guys?
What do you think then persuaded Prime Minister Ahmed to call this humanitarian truce on the 24th of March? What led to that, do you think?
It is hard to say what exactly pushed him over the edge, but I think the level of negotiations that has been going on, some led by Kenya, some led by the United States, the UN, the US new Horn of Africa envoy was there a few days before the truce was announced. I think it was just for anybody who had any heart, for anybody who had any sense. What is the point of denying people food that is not yours, the differences notwithstanding? I think maybe, to my mind, is they were shown the reality of their recalcitrant about what is plainly a horrible situation of playing poker and politics with people's lives. Ethiopia, until the last few decades, was a poster child for famine and drought. And so I think my sense is when these hit home, all the parties to the conflict realize that they cannot continue playing, this game where humans' life are at stake, where women and children are at stake. I think my sense is that because they have waved their hand against sanctions, individual sanctions, potential sanctions on the country, Ethiopia being removed from African AGOA, the U.S. Free trade agreement with African countries, all that did not move because I think what sometimes we fail to realize is that sanctions have only a limited impact, and that is only when the party on which the sanction is imposed feel that this will hurt. The United States doesn't give them money or doesn't give them support. UAE, Turkey, and Qatar are, ready to pick some of these countries. That makes it very difficult. Just to give you an example, Sudan was under the UN and US sanction for 20 years. It didn't change the behavior of Omar al-Hassan al-Bashir, the former president of Sudan's mind, until he was deposed just a few months ago. So I think that was the reality in my sense.
So the Prime Minister, I'm pretty sure, must have been feeling all of these pressures that you were talking about. And I just wonder, when he managed to push back the Tigrayan forces back beyond the border, he must have felt that this was a victory. But when we look at it now, it doesn't look like much of a victory, does it?
It really isn't. This is the sad reality of the conflict, my brother Peter, that nobody wins. When war erupts, nobody wins. Even when we consider that, one party has won and the other one has lost, no, you all lose. This is, for lack of better metaphor, this is a sibling rivalry between two groups that claim they are all Ethiopians. So if you're both fighting, and you're all Ethiopians, and you're all killing each other, the numbers, because, media, there's not a great deal of media access. Until now, there hasn't been a great deal of humanitarian access. We don't have the numbers. But people who have been trying to use open sources and otherwise are putting the number of people who have been killed to 500,000. That is conservative estimate. 500,000 people over the last few months, that's 15, 16 months, that have died. Are we going to claim, can any side claim that this is a victory? Mothers and women, children, uncles, the daily breadwinners, farmers who cannot plant there, even if we had rain in this season, houses that have been burned, lives that have been destroyed, livelihood that has gone up in smoke. Can we call that victory? I think, like I said at the beginning of this conversation, when the war broke out, I said nobody's going to win. Ethiopia is eventually going to be the loser, and Ethiopians are going to be the losers. I'm glad that, the humanitarian aid is going in. My only hope is that this will lead to a potential political settlement, and eventually, I think, mutual agreement that the current government in Tigray, the legitimate government, the current Ethiopian government in Addis, the two mutually agree that and respect that. And finally, accountability, Peter. We've seen some of the most horrendous, egregious human rights violations, using of aid, food aid as weapon of war, using rape as weapon of war, against the UN Security Council. I think this has to be dealt with. Otherwise, a few decades down the road, once this is settled, we'll come back and say, oh no, we are having another crisis inside Ethiopia.
People have been using the words starvation. That's not an exaggeration. That's how desperate things had become.
It is incredibly desperate. The news from Ethiopia, and particularly the Tigray region and the Afar region, and also parts of Oromo and parts of Amara region, is grim. Because once you go to war, all your efforts, human and otherwise, are dedicated to fighting a war. And when, as a country, you're always reliant on rain-fed agriculture, or you are relying on humanitarian aid, that puts you in an incredibly precarious situation. But in this case, it is self-inflicted. They walked into it, both parties, but the government side takes a huge responsibility. They walked into this with their eyes open, and now we are sitting here talking about famine. Like, for people of certain generation, particularly those who are born in early 80s and even in the late 70s, Ethiopia was a byword. We all remember the Band Aid, concert that was organized to save dying children in Ethiopia. And to think that in 2022, not because of natural causes, but because of fighting, and as a result, the government and the fighting groups are not allowing humanitarian aid to people who are in need, that is just not okay in 2022. It is not okay. It shouldn't be happening. Disagreements happen. There are mechanisms of solving this disagreement. But once we cast each other in existential terms, as long as Tigrayans are around or TPLF is around, we cannot leave, so therefore we have to get rid of them. Once we cast it in that language, we can justify anything, but this is not justifiable, Peter.
All right, so humanitarian truce in play now, and we're seeing the movement of aid. Could this be an opportunity for both sides to try and push through to a final political solution?
You would hope so. I think, like I say to you, there is always a window, however small. I am eternally optimistic that both parties would take this opportunity, use this as an opening salvo into what is going to be an incredibly difficult negotiation that the country has to have regardless. The political elite, whether they want it or not, there is going to be only one Ethiopia. We cannot completely, and short of nuclear annihilation, completely destroy a people. Even then, it's not it's not 100% foolproof. They have to talk to each other. It doesn't matter what has happened, but as part of that political settlement and negotiation, those who are deemed to have committed human rights violation and violation of international humanitarian law have to be brought to book, short of accountability. If we just say, let's have a political settlement for the sake of political settlement, I get it. There are no perfect peace. There are no perfect political settlements. But I think having to face what has happened and say to each other, at the very minimum, we are sorry, we are sorry. We have to carve for ourselves a united future is an incredibly important step. Having a commission that will deal with that has to be part of the package of political settlement. If done well, South Africans have shown us with all its problems, because it's never a perfect process, you can move forward. We have seen it in the case of South Sudan. You fail to deal with it, you will have to somehow come and deal with its consequences of not facing up to the reality. The African Union and the hybrid court that was supposed to be established wasn't established. And every time I read the Commission's report, the AU Commission's report, it is very, very similar to what happened in Ethiopia. And yet, as of last week, the vice president's house was surrounded, or the road leading to his house was surrounded by forces, by the government forces. We know what happened in 2016. We don't need to revisit that. And I think that is very important. I really hope that this is the beginning of a negotiated political settlement, but also as that part of that process, there has to be accountability. That is the only way we'll be able to resolve some of these problems in a fairly sustainable way.
Abdullahi, your insights always greatly appreciated. Thank you so much indeed for joining us tonight.
It's a pleasure to be on SABC anytime, Peter, and have a lovely week.
Thank you so much. Take care.